I'm much pleased tonight to introduce Professor Robert Fouser, who's no stranger to us. He served on the board, served as a counselor of Royal Asiatic Society for many years in the past. Even though he's out of the country, whenever he comes, he also conducts walking tours of Seoul. Professor Fouser holds a BA in Japanese language and literature and master's in applied linguistics, both from the University of Michigan and PhD in applied linguistics from Trinity College, Dublin. He studied the Korean language intensively at Seoul National University in the 1980s. During his time in Japan, he also taught foreign language education at Kyoto University and developed the Korean language program at Kagoshima University. From 2008, for 6 years, he taught Korean as a second foreign language education at Seoul National University. He's also translator of Understanding Korean Literature and also co-author of Hanok, the Korean House. In fact, he lived in a beautiful restored traditional Korean house in Seocheon. He's also author of 2 books in Korean, 미래 시민의 조건, The Conditions for Citizens in the Future, and also Seocheonholic. He's currently writing a book on the history of foreign language learning and teaching. He also writes regular columns for various media outlets in Korea. So today he's going to speak on a very interesting topic of the 386 generation and the quest for good country. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Fouser with a big round of applause.
Thank you for that very warm introduction. And it's very nice to be back and to see so many friends and several of my former students from Korea University in the 1980s. So it's very good to be among people who I love. So thank you for coming. As in the introduction, I'm not a historian, and the background of this topic is actually after moving back to the United States in 2014, I kept hearing this millennial generation over and over again, and I kind of wondered what was going on. And because, so I was able to sort of start thinking about what is a generation, and then of course I started thinking about myself and then the Korean people who are the same age as I am. I was born in 1961 and went to college in the 1980s and that kind of thing. So I started thinking about what is a generation and how does that influence history, and that's the background of this talk. So the outline is I'm going to first talk about this Strauss-Howe generational theory, and full disclosure, this theory is a favorite of Stephen Bannon, who is an advisor to President Trump in the United States. That's not why I chose this theory. And I actually had an interesting experience because where I live is near Harvard University, and I borrowed this book from Harvard University, and I thought nobody would ever want it, and it's this big book somewhere deep in the library you get. And then of course it was announced in the media that Stephen Bannon is influenced by this theory. 5 days later the book was recalled, so I had to go to Boston to return the book. But I was able to to find out what the theory was before. Then I'm going to talk about generations in Korea very briefly, and the bulk of the talk will be the life course of the 386 generation. And then I'll talk a little bit about future directions and a conclusion. So what is a generation? And this is from this book, which you can see here, the book that Mr. Bannon likes. And this is a sort of rather silly meta-historical kind of book. It tries to use this it tries to develop a predictive theory about a cycle of generations. And that's not really what I'm interested in. I'm more interested in the definition of a generation and how that relates to the 386 generation in Korea. So there are three defining character, or the sort of life cycle of a generation is childhood, young adulthood, midlife, and old age. So the 386 generation is now in midlife, okay? So to understand the 386 generation, or any other generation, you need to look at childhood, young adulthood, and these four phases. And the three defining characteristics of a social generation, according to this theory, is they experience key historical events and social trends during the same phase of life. And this is something that in the United States, again, as I just mentioned, that I went back in 2014 and I kept hearing stuff about the millennial generation over and over again. And people would say, you can't talk to the millennial generation, or how to understand the millennial generation. This is some big mystery or something. I never had that problem because I like coffee and so does the millennial generation, so I don't know. But anyway, you'll see these articles about how to manage in a business, how to personnel type management in the business, how to deal with this mysterious millennial generation. But there is a generation will experience key historical events and social trends, and those are different according to generations, obviously. And there are certain shared common beliefs and behaviors, okay, so that's a very important thing to think about. And then there's a shared sense of a common perceived membership in the generation. So you perceive yourself to be a member of a generation with other people around the same age. So these are the sort of three characteristics of a social generation. Then we have, this theory has lots of other pieces, but there's a sort of four moods, and then that makes a cycle of 80 or 90 years. This part is that predictive part, which, obviously we can't really predict the future, so this part isn't so interesting to me. But you have this, after a crisis, institutions are strong and individualism is weak. That would be, say, the baby boom generation. And then you have institutions are attacked and desire for personal and spiritual autonomy. That would be Gen X, say, in the United States, where this theory was developed. And then you have institutions are weak and distrusted, individualism is strong, and that would be the millennial generation. And then crisis, this would be the generation of people who are very young now, where you have an era of destruction, often involving war, oh dear, and then institutional life is destroyed and rebuilt in response to a perceived threat to the nation's survival. So this is probably what Mr. Bannon is finding exciting. But you have this cycle that repeats, okay? That's what this theory stresses. What is interesting to me is that you have this part is more interesting and important to understand the 386 generation. The historical events shape generations in childhood and young adulthood. In other words, in childhood and young adulthood, generations are more influenced by historical events. And then generations shape historical events in midlife and old age. So the influence from historical events is in the younger years, and then the generation will shape what happens later on based on that experience. And there's an alternation between crises and awakenings. This again is that cyclical theory of this, according to this theory. Generations in Korea there isn't really a book about generations in Korea. It'd be nice if somebody wrote one about generations in Korea. And often generations in Korea are described more in terms of, say, social trends, that kind of thing. But clearly we can have, if we go back, this is just a very quick sort of cursory summary that I came up with. You can have an independence generation. This generation was born in the late 19th century. Came of age during the era of independence, resisted colonial rule. Then you have a colonial generation. They were born in the early 20th century, came of age during the Japanese colonial period. Korean War generation, born at the end of the colonial period, came of age during the Korean War, the April 19th revolution in 1960. And then another generation after that would be the baby boom generation around the Korean, that was born after the Korean War and came of age during the Park Chung-hee era. And that would be, say, the people who are a little bit, who are above the 386 generation, which is, this generation was born as industrialization and urbanization began, and they came of age in the 1980s. So that's where you get the 386, the 1980s, being the age when this generation entered society, when they left childhood. And the big event for them would be the Gwangju Massacre in 1980 and the democracy movement that followed, along with, of course, the economic growth and social changes that came along with that. The other generations, this is sort of what would appear in the Korean media, and they're very, very short. You know, Korean media, it looks like each generation is only 10 years. In general, a generation is considered a phase of life which would be about 20 years, 18, 20, 22 years, depending. So this is used more for sort of describing social trends, but you have Generation X, born during the Yushin era and came of age in the 1990s. If anybody saw the film, I think that 2014 film, Konchu Kakkeron, which was a film about architect students in the 1990s, this generation would be what was in that film. Then you have Generation W, born in the 1980s, etc., and the kind of the different mix of generations following the one that we're focusing on. The word 386 comes from, obviously, this is an ad for computers at the time, but it comes from people who are in their 30s, now they're in their 50s, and they went to university in the 1980s and they were born in the 1960s. So these, born in the 1960s, going to university in the 1980s, those are the two key things to understand the 386 generation. But some interesting sort of figures to talk about how to understand the 386 generation. If you look at Korea in 1975, so this would be when the 386 people born in the 1960s were children, you can see the population pyramid was very young. So this means this is a very large generation. The 386 generation is very large, and then of course, this is 10 years ago, or 12 years ago, but they have started to enter middle age. So this is a much larger generation than the previous generations. So that's an important thing to understand about the 386 generation. And then economic growth, and you can see that the real GDP in Korea went way up. This is the IMF, but the real boom was happening when this generation was started to go to university, and during those young years when the people in this generation were in their 20s and 30s, a real boom in economic growth. And you can see this, of course. This is Korea, so Korea has almost caught up to Japan. Again, the big boom happened when this generation was young. Another basic interesting thing about this generation, when I talk to Koreans who are about my age, many of them were born in rural areas, or small towns, rural areas, and this, of course, is reflected in this, where you have the rapid pace of urbanization that started right around the 1960s, and up until, within 30 years, you had most of Korea being urban. So this is a very important thing to understand, that this is really the first generation of Koreans that were mostly urban, that mostly lived in a city area. If you look at, say, younger generations, the urbanization was very, very small. Most countries like, say, Canada, the United States, or European countries, urbanization is about 80%, 75%, 85%, depending on the country. So this is a very, very interesting, the rapid pace of urbanization. Then you have the boom in university enrollment, and again, you can see starting here, right around, let me see, right around the 80s, okay, this is the 80s, and going up into the 2000s, this period, 1980 to 2000, the number of university students boomed. And that is something that's very important, because the 386 generation is the first generation in Korean history where most people, or a large number of people, went to college. Before that, college was very much an elite kind of thing in Korea. And you can see by tertiary educational attainment, for younger people, Korea is #1 now, at least compared to these other countries. But among the older generation, Korea is the lowest. So this is that boom in university education that affected the difference between the older generations in Korea, in which many people didn't go to college, most people didn't go to college, and younger generations where now it's 70%. This is interesting, change in housing. This is 단독주택 means single-family house, and of course, even in 1980, most Koreans lived in single-family houses. And the number of people who lived in apartments was relatively small. This again boomed during started to boom in the 1980s and really picked up speed in the 1990s. So what this means is again, the 386 generation is really the first generation where they followed the development of the apartment. The apartment is a very, very new kind of living arrangement in Korean history. It's only from the 2000s that the apartment became the most popular type of living. Then we have growth of Christianity, and this again, if you look at 1970, and again, this period, this boom in Christianity, but it sort of topped off. The Christianity slowed, okay? So this is why younger Koreans, again, are not so interested in Christianity as much as the older generations. And you can see this big change in Christianity. That's a distinguishing feature between, say, younger Koreans and older Koreans. So, to talk about the lifestyle, the life cycle of the 386 generation, in childhood, obviously they were attending school. And during that time, there was the Yusin dictatorship, the assassination of Park Chung-hee, and extreme conformity, the social mood, and the economy was rapid growth punctuated by a crisis. The 1979, when Park was assassinated, there was an economic crisis. The next phase would be young adulthood, so that's university, going into the workforce, that kind of thing. And the Gwangju Massacre, 1980, democracy movement, Seoul Olympics, IMF crisis, and Nomuhyun. So there were a lot of things that happened during this this 20 years when this generation was in college and then, entering the workforce and starting to form families. And this was conformity followed by rapid liberalization, rapid urbanization, this huge change of life from a more rural, agrarian style, to what the city life that we now know as how Koreans live. And again, rapid growth punctuated by a crisis, which would be the IMF. And then we have midlife, which is where the 386 generation is now, work and family, and the world financial crisis of 2008, which Korea was not as badly affected as many other countries, but there was still an effect, and demonstrations against Park Geun-hye, which of course started just at the end of last year. And during this period, there was liberalization, reverses, rapid diffusion of IT. The 2000s was really the rapid diffusion of IT in Korea. And then we had economic growth slowed, and growing economic worries. And I'll talk about that near the end. Old age, we don't know what's going to happen. The 386 generation is not at old age yet, but will be there in probably 5 years. That will be when the first members will start entering older age. Very crowded schools. One of my best Korean friends was born in 1961, as I was, and he talked about having 63 students in the average class in his school. And of course, that's something that would be unthinkable nowadays. Any school now would want those students because it would keep the school open. So especially the older schools in Seoul. Early stages of industrialization, urbanization begins, changes in housing, and the Park Chung-hee dictatorship, nationalism, and anti-communism, all those things that we now think are very, very far back, are actually things that people my age, somebody born in 1961, would have experienced. So here's these crowded schools, and again, this is kind of interesting because one research topic that was common in Korea in the 1980s, up until the 1980s in education, was how to deal with large classrooms. And I remember when I was a university student in the University of Michigan in the 1980s, some Korean students that I met at the time were doing research in education at the University of Michigan, and they were all interested in how to deal with large classrooms. That was one of the main research topics, because you have this, so how can one teacher deal with this? This would have been kind of typical sort of shanty towns. Seoul had shanty towns up into the 1980s, even into the 90s. And of course, rural life would have looked like this. And apartments were not the main, they were just starting to be advertised as the new modern way of life. 1970s, again, is childhood, the same, again, maybe entering teenage years, and we have the same kind of rapid social change going on. And the 1972 Yushin Constitution, which was extreme social controlism, nationalism, and anti-communism. And anybody in that generation will probably know what I'm talking about. But educational levels started to rise, and that's kind of something that was interesting. This again shows the transition. You start to have more apartments, starting to move away from single-family houses. And these are things, when I said rigid social control, this is, the police measuring the length of the skirt, and clearly this lady would be punished if the skirt were too short. And men having their hair cut because their hair was too long. So I remember when I came to Korea in the 1980s, it was kind of normal for a lot of men to have longish hair, because that was a kind of reaction against this Yushin type, strict social control at the time in the 1970s. And then this was a course that students had to take military training. So many of my friends, people 1961, my best Korean friend, did this in high school. He had a military training course in high school. So this was, again, this, Park Chung-hee's 1970 rigid dictatorship that enforced this kind of experience. Then there were many Park Chung-hee-like campaigns. This was a campaign to eat less rice. And in the 1970s, restaurants were required to mix barley in rice. You couldn't get just pure white rice. So this was something that Park Chung-hee enforced, and this was a campaign to eat less rice, so you donated the rice at this time. Again, unthinkable nowadays, but this would be something that somebody in the 386 generation would have heard his or her parents talking about. Right? Because obviously if this went on in the 1970s, this is something they would have experienced or heard about. But under the surface, there was resistance, and one was, I chose Yang Hee-eun because I like her music, but also because she sang at one of the candlelight demonstrations at the end of last year. Kind of folk song, and there were some interesting articles I found in the newspapers at this time where these folk songs and wearing blue jeans and all these things were considered decadent, decadent. And then this is a sort of Minjuk Munage Pam. This was 1974, and this was sort of the beginning of a desire to understand Korean culture from a more Korean-centric point of view, and this was, people were punished for these kind of things, censorship and that kind of thing, just like this was considered decadent. But these activities helped pave the way for the democracy movement in the 1980s. So, moving up to the 1980s, this is when actually I first came to Korea in 1983, and many in the audience would remember this time as well. Many different things happened. You have the assassination of Park Chung-hee, economic downturn. The biggest thing for this generation would be the Gwangju massacre, which followed democracy movement in 1980. And then you have all these, Chung Il-hwan becomes president, democracy is denied. One thing that is often not so, commonly mentioned is the University admission quotas were relaxed, so that's what caused the boom in higher education. Up until the 1980s, early 1980s, universities were, had many fewer spaces. And then suddenly these controls, the number of people who could be admitted to a university were relaxed in the 1980s, and you had an expansion of the number of students, and that may have helped lead the way, of course, to some of the democracy movements that began at that time. At the same time, of course, you had the preparation for the Seoul Olympics and the political tensions that went around that. And I remember in the 1980s when I lived here, a lot of Koreans would think, well, after the Seoul Olympics, Korea is going to be an advanced country. So the Seoul Olympics were used to try to keep dissent in line and that kind of thing. There was that tension between democracy's desire for change and democracy and the government saying, using the Seoul Olympics to try to keep people from demonstrating or expressing anti-government sentiments. Again, these underground movements that were very strictly prohibited during Park Chung-hee's time, they started to coalesce, come to the surface, and they became this large democracy movement that grew in the 1980s. The 1985 occupation of the American Cultural Center, that began the rise of anti-Americanism, which was it remains a controversial issue in Korea. And of course, 1987 democracy movement, presidential election, and the general election. The general election in 1988 isn't mentioned so much because the democracy movement gets most attention, but that was the first time that the government lost control of the National Assembly. There was an election in 1985 where the government didn't win the majority of the seats, but some of the seats were still appointed at that time, so they still were able to maintain a parliamentary majority. This was the first time that the government lost that parliamentary majority, so it was a big step ahead for Korean democracy. And of course, at the same time, there were labor movements and social and political movements came to the surface. Labor movements were a big thing at the time as well. And you had a liberalization and cultural flowering. And of course, I remember one thing that I liked to do in the 1980s was go to plays at Taeyangno. Taeyangno was a big place where students would, go to plays in small theaters. And liberalization of the media, arts, those kind of things all went along with that time. Plays, I would go to a lot of plays at the time, partly because I was interested and partly because that was a great way to practice Korean. So you can see newspapers of the headlines. The number died is higher than this, but this is a newspaper immediately after the event. These shocking political events that had a strong influence on the 386 generation. And this, again, the social change. This is, more traditional. This is actually, I think, the Unma Apatu in Gangnam. And so you have this building these, new apartments in an area which had been agricultural, kind of symbol of the rapid change in society at the time. This is how the government used the Olympics, the countdown, all these different things, at the time to try to keep people in line, and of course the Olympics on cigarettes. Anybody who smokes in here might remember these cigarettes, and of course the subway. So this was the idea of the Olympics as sort of bringing progress. Not everybody in the 386 generation demonstrated or went out on the street or that kind of thing. There would be people who believed, that after the Olympics, Korea would become a modern developed nation. And campuses, university campuses, again, this is a Pungul kind of, discovery of Korean arts, which continued what had started in the 1970s. So there was this, the campuses became politically active, and there was an interest in discovering Korean tradition and Korean arts. And I still remember when I was at Korea University, every afternoon students would practice this, and I still can't forget it, the sound. It's like in my head. So, a lot of students became very interested in these kind of cultural expressions of Korean, kind of defining Korean culture in a new way. And this is the occupation of the American Cultural Center in 1985, right across from Lotte Hotel, which is now, the building is now used as a wax museum, which is kind of funny. But anyway, this at the time was a kind of a shocking event. The idea of, and it says America should take responsibility or apologize for what happened in Gwangju, because there was a perception that the U.S. was involved in what happened in Gwangju. These are the 1987 street demonstrations. And I was here in Korea at the time, and of course very careful. I didn't take any pictures. These are all media pictures from the newspapers and things. That's why they're black and white. I was deathly afraid to take pictures because at this time there wasn't that freedom to take pictures, and so it was a tense environment. But these are again 386 students, right? These are young students who went down. This is Jongno Street. And they went out in the streets and demonstrated, and that is what eventually convinced Chun Doo-hwan to hold a presidential election. And of course, this is the Lee Han-yeol, the funeral for Lee Han-yeol in 1987, and again, the idea of mass political expression, organizing. The demonstrations in 1987, there were no cell phones, there were no, people organized. And I remember one day I was in Myeongdong near the Central Post Office, and suddenly people would come out of an alleyway, and there was sort of this playing chicken with the police, but how to avoid the police. So there was an information network in place about how to successfully run a large-scale demonstration. And that, of course, has continued, right, if we think about the recent events. This is labor movements began at this time, and those were under strict political control during most of Chun Doo-hwan's administration. So it wasn't just people think, well, the democracy movement was the only thing. The democracy movement was just one of a number of things that were going on. It's the most prominent and the most maybe something that we remember, but there were labor movements at the time, and there was this, the Minjung art, which arose at this time. So it wasn't just about the political side of wanting a direct presidential election, but it was a broad cultural and social outpouring of desire for change. And so and of course, the 386 generation, the students or people who demonstrated in 1987, they were successful at forcing Chun Doo-hwan to hold a presidential election, and then they were also successful in changing the National Assembly 1 year later. So this was a successful change. In other words, this generation achieved its goal. So that is something that's quite interesting, because if you think about other, say the Vietnam War generation in the United States, or the similar demonstrations in Japan, may not have achieved their goals. May or may not. That's something we can talk about in the question time. But anyway, the confidence and the ability to change things among the people in the 386 generation developed from their successful drive for social change. These are just some pictures I took. It's not a self-promotion, but this was Jongno and sort of the center of Seoul. And when all of this was going on, of course, there was also the rise. Again, the economy was booming. The economy was growing through all of this time. So there was a rise of sort of consumption culture. And I remember this cafe here, Bonjour or something. I can't remember the name, but there was a cafe here. And this was sort of, they served good coffee. Before this, you had to go to a latte hotel or something. So there was a rise of consumer culture as well. And because the economy was growing at the same time as the political changes were going on. And that's a very interesting thing to remember, that the economy was growing as the politics were changing, because the government at the time kept pushing the idea of a trade-off. In other words, if you have democracy and liberalization, the economy will go down. So you need strict social control and dictatorship to keep the economy growing. That was partly the government's argument, and one of the arguments that Chun Doo-hwan, one of his ideas when he took power was that, well, I have to save the country from collapsing. This kind of thing, the growth of the economy at the same time that democratization was going on, shows that theory wasn't necessarily true. And since then, the 386 generation has not really, has tried to resist that idea of a trade-off between stability and economic growth. Young Adulthood, the 1990s, some big changes, But again, this was when the 386 generation was starting to form families, join the workforce. You have rapid economic growth. This continues. And you have the continuation of democratization and liberalization that began in the 1990s, 1980s. Kim Il-sung, the first he was the first civilian president elected in a very long time, 1992. Boom in higher education continues, and educational levels rise. Again, you have more people going to college, so the education level in Korea rose very, very rapidly at this time. And that is something to keep in mind about the changes in society going on. And the apartment boom, suburbs developed, there are many, but Bundang and Ilsan were the first big planned suburban areas in Korea. And then you have the PC boom, and the internet starts to spread. So there's an interesting thing about the 386 generation in college. A lot of people were interested in politics, social change, that kind of thing. But then in the 1990s, they moved toward IT. Okay, a lot of people became interested in IT. And then the IMF crisis, the election of Kim Dae-jung. So this sort of neoliberal era begins. This is Han Bi-ya. I've never read her books, sorry. But she was, an early, this is interesting because it was the 386 generation was the first generation to travel in its youth. Because foreign travel was liberalized in 1989. So before that, it was difficult for people just to travel overseas easily. It became much easier after 1989. So Han Bi-ya in the 1990s, these kind of books were popular because this generation was traveling, okay? And of course the automobile became popular, so there was a big boom in consumption as well. Overseas travel could be a sign of consumption. And the rise of these large apartment, what we think of as how Koreans live now, this was a 1990s phenomenon. And you can see different films. The Korean film industry recovered in the 1990s. This was the first hit, 1993, I think, 1992. 1993, I can't remember. But there were later in the decade, Korean films became popular. So that was another sign of the continuing sort of cultural renaissance that began in the 1980s. And this is a wonderful, I'm so lucky I found this, this is high-tech chatting, which actually I remember doing when I would visit from Japan in the 1990s. I remember, with a Korean friend, I think it was 1994, 1997, 1998, maybe around there. I visited Korea, and I stayed with a Korean friend, and I said I wanted to get on the internet. He said okay, and there was no modem sound. Until then it was, you have to use you had to call, and there'd be whatever sound, and however the modem was, and he had a cable modem in his house, so there was no need, and that was something that Kim Dae-jung developed to try to help recover the economy. So things like just the IT infrastructure started to move ahead in Korea at that time, and of course using these kind of chat rooms. This started at that time. I lived in Japan in the 1990s, and in Japan you still had to call up with a modem, and they would charge you about 10 yen for every minute or something. So if you weren't careful, if you were on the internet, you would have a very, very large phone bill. And I remember one month I had a $190 phone bill. So when I came to Korea to visit my friend, and he was paying, maybe $30 a month for 24-hour access via a cable modem, I helped, Young at this time. And that is something you can see in this figure. You have the boom in the internet at this time. And if you look at the news from the late 1990s, there's just article after article about click, or the spread of the internet. And that is something that the 386 generation experienced because they were still young at the time. And then, of course, the sort of end of that youth era for the 386 generation would have been the IMF, the sort of the collapse, near economic collapse in 1997, when Korea had to seek help from the IMF. So that brought an end, in a way, to kind of that pushed. Then after that, the 386 generation started to enter midlife. And midlife, of course, there was Kim Dae-jung visits North Korea in 2000, the election of Roh Moo-hyun, which was very interesting. I wasn't in Korea at the time, but I was watching events. And at that time, instead of cell phones, many Koreans had pagers. Okay, and pagers were very popular. So Korean friends or people would page each other. They would send messages to each other and say, "Get out and vote," and that kind of thing. So there was again that organizing for social change. That tradition continued and affected the election of Roh Moo-hyun. And then, of course, as I've just mentioned, there in midlife, the IT ventures and rapid diffusion of the internet continued. Economic growth slowed, social changes slowed. So that's something to keep in mind, that as the 3086 generation entered midlife, there was a slowing down of some of those rapid social change from the 1980s and 1990s. And then, of course, new topics came up in the 2000s, say the decline of rural areas. If you go to a rural area in Korea nowadays, almost everybody is older. Of course, the same is true in Japan and many other countries. It's not just a Korean problem. And even regional cities, sort of the problem of the decline of regional cities and the everything being Seoul-centered. So that is actually why President Roh Moo-hyun at the time wanted to build the Sejong city as a way to help decentralize things from Seoul. So these new problems, and related to this, of course, new problems started to rise: alienated youth, cost of living, declining fertility rate, etc. So very different issues from the 1980s and 1990s. And there was a rapid increase in the number of foreigners living in Korea. Of course, foreigners are only less than, I think foreigners are about 2% of the Korean population, so we're not talking about a large group, but again, foreign workers, foreigners living in Korea, that increased in the 1990s, in the 2000s, a lot of the increase in number of foreigners. Unquote, international marriages, that kind of thing, that began to increase in the 2000s. And the election of Lee Myung-bak and Roh Moo-hyun's suicide, these were shocking events for many people in not just the 386 generation, but the 386 generation kind of took this as, some people I know who are around my age or a little bit younger, Roh Moo-hyun's suicide, they kind of took that as a wake-up call and became interested in politics again after this event. Not everybody, but certain people in this age group. And then the world financial crisis in 2008. So, again, Kim Dae-jung's visit to North Korea, that was something that, and Roh Moo-hyun's election, these were symbols of a kind of openness, a kind of, again, the idea of Korea moving forward to greater openness and democracy and those kind of things. And as I just mentioned with Hanbi, in discussing Hanbi-ya, you had this boom in the 1990s with foreign travel starting here, and then of course in the 2000s, just much more foreign travel. And that of course is something that is really distinguishes the 386 generation from previous generations who did not have that opportunity to travel when they were younger. They could travel later, but many of them were dealing with families and other issues in life. So the 386 generation really is the first well-traveled generation. And again, the decline in the fertility rate. And this is an article that talks about, you need 3 samo, or about $280,000, I guess, I don't know. $280,000 to raise a child. So the idea of raising children as being expensive, this kind of thing, is something that the 386 generation started to have to deal with in midlife. And here we have, again, this is property prices, apartment prices. And you have this boom in apartment prices going all the way up. It was 2000, starting around Roh Moo-hyun's election and way up until the financial crisis of 2008. This big rise in property values. And again, if anybody has ever experienced trying to find an apartment or a place to live in an expensive city, you can understand that that kind of thing will create worry about the ability to find a place to live, worry, concerns about money, these kind of things. So that in midlife, the 386 generation started to face these, or perceived, I don't know if they're real or not, but let's say they started to worry about money issues. The idea of things kind of being on a positive trajectory sort of started to fade away because people in the 386 generation were worried about the cost of housing, they were worried about being able to provide for their children. These kind of issues really began to hit in midlife. And then we have, this was 2008 after Lee Myung-bak became president, again, organizing mass demonstrations against the importation of American beef. I think they did it anyway, so they weren't successful in overturning Lee Myung-bak or changing the policy. And this is the funeral for President Roh Moo-hyun, which again, as I mentioned, for many people in this generation, was a wake-up call to take an interest in politics again. And so these events are recent. But again, midlife, we're still in midlife in the 2010s, and there's only 3 years left in this decade. I mean, next year is 2008, we're really going towards the 2020s when people like me will be 60, or in our 60s, so, you're dealing with time moving on. Economic growth continues to slow, retirement wave begins. This is the latest issue that the 386 generation is having to deal with, is retirement, okay? So, retirement in Korea is, how are you going to provide for yourself after you retire? Again, that kind of worry is on the minds of a lot of people. And we have the Sewol ferry sinking and the demonstrations against former president, Park Geun-hye. She was president at this time. And these, again, are events that are, say, related to the response to President Roh Moo-hyun's suicide, wake-up calls, and again, a sign of the 386 generation coming together to try to cause political change. And this is the historical growth of GDP in Korea, and you can see it's come down. And of course, any economist will tell you this is a normal thing. And of course, the latest figure, 2015, was 2.4% or something like that. That would be, in a lot of advanced countries, that is still a relatively high number. But it's the decline compared to what it had been. And this is something that, again, the 386 generation is having to deal with, the idea that economic growth is no longer guaranteed. That's something that is on people's minds. And related to that is this wave of retirements. And I think here it says, starting, around people born in 1966 here, so you can see people who are my age, you're going to have a very, very large wave of retirements, which might be very good for younger people. Now, for example, in Japan, there's the population pyramid is older than it is in Korea, so there's been a huge wave of retirements of people born after World War II, Second World War. So there's a shortage of younger workers, so it may be very good for younger people. But what it means is that the 386 generation is starting to worry about how it's going to provide for itself in retirement. This is just a picture I put in. This is a reunion of some of the people who occupied the American Cultural Center in 1985. And they all look a bit older. So I just put that in to kind of show that they're actually middle-aged now. And then we have this is a protest on one of the, I think it's maybe, I don't know which anniversary it is, or, protest related to the sinking of the Sewol ferry. And then these are the recent candlelight protests, which I missed, too bad. It would be interesting to have been here at this time. This is actually a very interesting photo, because this would be, say, the children of the 386 generation, or the next generation participating in political activities, which is kind of interesting because when I was in the United States, 2004, going back, and this recent presidential election, oh dear, don't get me on that, but the recent presidential election, there was a lot of talk about what younger Americans want, and the whole idea of younger generations taking a new interest in politics and being involved in political issues. So this is, again, the 386 generation. A lot of people who participated in these went to this as a family, not as individuals. And that's something that, of course, would have been unheard of in the 1980s because it would have been too dangerous. So what's going to happen to the 386 generation? Workforce in Korea will continue to shrink. Will the economy continue to slow? Poverty after retirement? These are all questions. I don't know. I can't predict. Will there be a trend towards conservatism that often happens as people age? Or will there be a redefining of retirement and old age? All of these are questions about what the future direction of the 386 generation will be. And again, you can see that in 2030, which is only 13 years from now, that's not a long time, okay? Only 13 years from now, the population pyramid of Korea will look like this. So the number of people in older age, or past retirement or near retirement, will be greater, will be very, very large. So how will this affect society and the economy? The labor force growth, again, Korea peaked in 2015. Where's Korea? Here. 2015 was the peak of the labor force, and the labor force is going down. And of course, what that simply means is that more people are not working as opposed to working, so the working people will have to pay more in taxes or some sort of, that will influence what goes on as far as providing for the people who are not working. So the labor force growth is something that will affect Korea. Maybe robots or artificial intelligence or that kind of thing will take the place, but that's another topic and we can't really predict how that will work. But you can see that the labor force in Korea will continue to decline, which means the burden on younger people to take care of older generations will be greater. And of course, that's related to this problem of senior citizen poverty in Korea. And this is poverty after taxes and transfers. So that means after, say, pensions, national pensions, or transfer of through taxes. Korea is by far the highest poverty rate. So you have, what is it? It's almost 50% of senior citizens in Korea live in poverty after the transfer from taking into account taxes. And of course, the United States is high and the other countries, and the lowest would be the Netherlands, which is maybe 3%. That would be the idea of, say in Europe, the social system is better than other countries. But the problem is Korea is by far the highest. So half of Korean senior citizens live in poverty, which is an extremely high number. So it would be natural for people in the 386 generation to worry what's going to happen to me when I retire, and that kind of thing. So this is a big problem that this generation will face soon. So to conclude, if you define what is the 386 generation, they experienced economic boom. That was one thing. Urbanization, dictatorship, and they led the democracy movement. Okay? So these things are really the defining characteristics. It's not just the democracy movement, it's the dictatorship in their childhood years, urbanization, social changes, and economic growth. All of these come together to kind of define the experience that the 386 generation has. And then when it comes to share certain common beliefs and behaviors, resist authority is very, very strong. Attack institutions, again, this relates to the political activity of this generation. And a desire for personal and spiritual autonomy, that is also, say, common with the baby boom generation in the United States. And confidence and embrace challenges and new trends. So this generation has all of these common ideas and characteristics. Embracing IT, the interest in IT, that is something, the idea of being open to new things was something that was very dominant for this generation. And when it comes to share a certain sense of common perceived membership in that generation, the democracy movement is really the defining thing for a lot of people in this generation. Continued interest in social and political issues. So that is also, and that would be reflected in the recent demonstrations against Park Geun-hye, the idea that we have to take a stand, we have to go out in the streets, we have to deal with this problem. So that is a defining characteristic of this generation. Finally, this is 이게 나라냐, which is very hard to translate. Is this a country? You're going to be literal, it would be, is this a country? But I think one sort of the spirit of the 386 generation, or partly can be brought up by looking at this word, these signs. In other words, they have this idea of a good country. There's this concept or idea of a good country. And I remember when I lived, in the 1980s, talking to Koreans my age, I was young at the time, and there was this idea of what a good country is and what a bad country is. And a dictatorship is a bad country. A democracy is a good country. A poor country is a bad country too. And a rich country is a good country. And of course that was very interesting for me. I had trouble dealing with the idea of, not trouble, but I had to kind of wrap myself around the idea that, we want an economic boom and we want democracy at the same time. Because that it was just interesting how that was defined. So I think there's the 386 generation, one of their sort of common beliefs is this idea of a good country. They have an idea of a good country. And what that is, again, some people in the audience are 386 generation members, so you can, ask questions during the question time. But a prosperous, fair, democratic society respected in the world. Okay, so it's this idea of prosperous. In other words, being poor is not a good thing. Okay, fair, democratic society respected in the world. And there's a denial, as I mentioned briefly before, a denial of this trade-off between economic development and democracy. And that's something that Park Chung-hee used for his whole time as president. Well, my presidency is, we don't need democracy, or we'll have Korean democracy, unquote. Because that brings stability, which brings economic growth. So this is something I think that this is really the first generation in Korea to take that idea and not accept that idea that you have a trade-off between democracy and economic growth. And that I don't think this generation necessarily everybody read a book by Kim Gu. But I think what Kim Gu's vision of Korea was in the 1940s is something that helps define what expresses what the 386 generation feels. I want our nation to become the most beautiful nation in the world. I do not want our nation to become the richest and powerful nation in the world, because I have felt the pain of being invaded by another nation. I do not want my nation to invade others. It is sufficient that our wealth is such that it makes our lives abundant, and our military such that it is able to repel others' invasion. The only thing that I desire in infinite quantity is the power of highly developed culture. This is because the power of culture both makes ourselves happy and gives happiness to others. So I think this is a little bit what the 386 generation defines as a good country. And of course, no country is perfect, so the 386 generation is a perfect country. But when political events or things deviate from that idea of what is a good country, then this generation will go out in the street and demand political change, as has happened recently. So I think that's kind of the defining characteristic of the 386 generation is this idea of a good country. What will happen to that as this generation ages is a very interesting thing. Will we have, in 15 years, 할머니, 할아버지 going out in the streets in Kwangan? We might. I don't know. It's an interesting thought. Again, it may not be that this generation follows the typical path of many other generations of becoming more passive or conservative as it ages. It may be that they will keep this idea and demand political change even as they age. So I think that we just don't know what will happen, but it's an interesting question. So that is it. Thank you very much.
So, any questions? Okay. Okay, sorry.
What about their attitude vis-a-vis North Korea?
Interesting question, and I was going to put it in the presentation. I guess I can answer by saying I don't really know. Because I think North Korea is not so central to their experience. North Korea is more peripheral to their experience. Yeah. But of course in the 1980s, after democratization, there was an interest in reunification, but North Korea is a little bit peripheral to their experience. But yeah, it's something I debated about putting in the presentation. But I don't really know. And it's something that, again, when I lived in Korea in the 1980s as a member, young, 386er, I guess, North Korea is very hard to talk about, until after democratization. But it's a very good question, which I can't answer, sorry.
Okay.
One impression I get of the 386 generation's concept of the good country is that it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of derived from looking at other countries, comparison to other countries,
Yes.
especially the US or even Japan, saying why don't we have what they have? Do you think that if that's true, that impression can evolve away from being comparison driven or drawn from comparisons to other countries? Can there be, the concept of the good country that is not based on another country? If that makes sense.
That's a good question too. I think the subsequent generations are less interested in that comparison. But I think with the 386 generation, because they grew up in their youth with the idea of Japan as this very rich country, even things like in the 1980s, when I would take the ferry from Shimonoseki to Busan, everybody had bananas except me. And I wondered, why does everybody have bananas? And they'd get out through customs and people would buy bananas. So Japan in a sense was this land of bananas. But the younger generations don't have that material idea that Japan is a wealthy country. And of course, Korea's almost caught up to Japan. So I think the younger generations may feel what you're expressing, but for the 386 generation, I think there will always be some sort of comparison, because that's the experience they grew up with in their youth.
I think you compare between the student movement group in Europe and,
Right.
and our 386 generation. Probably, I don't know. You mentioned about that our 386 generation, we deny the trade-off between economic development and democracy. Probably you can compare between the student movement group in the Europe. Probably, I don't know. Their characteristic probably they are similar with us, or what differences between each other.
Very good question. Are you a 386er? Our generation, or?
In Europe's student
okay.
movement in 60s, that student movement groups.
Right. I don't know so much about the situation in Europe, but I can talk a little bit about the United States. The sort of anti-war movement, protests against the war in Vietnam. economic growth was not as much an issue for that generation. It was much more about response to what was going on at the time, the desire for social change, but the common thing was that desire for social change and a resistance to authority. So that is a common point. I think economic growth was not as much an issue for, say, the United States or Europe or even Japan. And it was desire for social change. And that is probably because the speed of economic growth was slower in Europe and the United States. So again, the material difference between older generations and younger generations is less. And those countries did not have leaders using economic growth as a reason to deny democracy. I think, yeah, but that's a very good question. Comparing things. Yes?
Yeah, thank you. You kind of may have answered this already, but a key theme that you've been discussing is obviously the desire for democracy among the 386 generation, but historically that isn't a given in Korea or in East Asia. So I'm just wondering where that great desire for democracy came from. And perhaps also, now the 386ers are in their 50s, I'm just wondering whether they have an equally strong desire to deal with corruption in the country, which seems to be the next thing they really need to deal with.
Oh, okay.
Two things.
I think the desire, say the three Korea, I don't know about Japan or the others, I'll leave that as out of the answer, but I think for the 386 generation in Korea, democracy is good. In other words, democracy is, a good country is a democratic country.
And where are they getting that idea?
And that idea probably came from their education, the rigidity of the education about, say, the United States or the West, or that this is a benchmark that they need to achieve. So I think that the idea of an advanced, good country is a democratic country. That is a very, very strong idea. Corruption and that kind of thing, I can't answer that. I don't know. I'm not sure how corrupt Korea is compared to other countries, even the United States. So I don't know. But I think if that is perceived as something that is damaging to the nation, they may take a greater interest in that. Yes. Yeah.
Well, in 2008, the global crisis, worldwide.
Yes.
Some demonstrators protested against globalization.
Yes.
Well, you picked up some Korean figures like Kim Gu. You highlight his bright side. But some critics say that he was quite nationalistic. And nowadays, worldwide, the issue of globalization is quite on the surface. And I'm just wondering whether you can find any cosmopolitan spirit in 386 generation, or they are quite nationalistic. Well,
yes, very good question. I would say they're quite nationalistic because that is what informed their experience during childhood, and the idea. So I think they're quite nationalistic. If there is, as you say, a cosmopolitan spirit, that would have come from the foreign travel when they were younger, and in older as they got older. But I think that the 386 generation is quite nationalistic. So if you're wanting cosmopolitan, I think you have to go to younger generations. Does that answer your question? Yes.
Okay, one last question.
Yes! One of my former students from Korea University.
I think the 386 generation is probably the most stressed generation. Having experienced the economic boom in the 80s and 90s, and probably experienced the rising level expectation.
Yes, yes.
Many of them, if they could not afford, many of them went to the States, and many of them came back, became leaders in different fields, and also sending their kids to the US and other European countries, and also send mothers along with the kids, becoming 기러기 아빠.
Yes, yes.
So I think
Interesting.
but I think right now, I think among those younger generation, a lot of them are saying perhaps there may not be need to go abroad to study as much as they used to.
Right.
And like the Japan, I think the number of students going to the States has decreased tremendously. And having gone abroad to study is kind of a disadvantage. So a lot of the I think Korean students and younger generations, they are thinking, why not stay in Korea and here? So I think the frustration with it, I think level of expectation is coming down to deal with the maybe perhaps disappointments and perhaps the kind of deal with their not achieving their goals and dreams.
Right.
So
very good point.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think Koreans are probably looking toward more inward now,
Yes.
instead of trying to emulate U.S. and its democracy. So you get, I think Korea is becoming more nationalistic in that sense, although there's an international feeling, a global, we need to be global. I think maybe look more inward nowadays.
Interesting. Yes. Yes.
I want to kind of get your comment on that.
Well, certainly that would be true in Japan, yes, and that's a very good point that you made about Korea as well. It's the situation, the sort of inward lookingness in Japan is something that actually the Japanese government is trying to address. So they're trying to actually promote, students going abroad and that kind of thing because they feel that Japan is turning inward, almost like the whole country is becoming hikikomori or something. So that is something that the Japanese government is trying to address, and it may be in Korea. So then the interesting question would be, what is causing it? Because Korea and Japan have a different experience. And it may be that it's also happening in other countries as well. So that is perhaps, I had dinner with a 29-year-old student a couple days ago. No, not student, young employee now, but I knew him as a student, and he kept talking about worries about employment, 고용 불안. He used that word, worries about employment. And he works for Hyundai construction company. He's 29 years old, and he said probably in 10 years I won't work here anymore. So he's already preparing for what he's going to do for his unemployed years as a middle-aged man at 29 years old. I was doing other things when I was 29 years old. So you're right about this insecurity. And I think it's that insecurity about employment, future prospects, that may be what is driving people inward more than a national identity or nationalism or that kind of thing. But it's maybe a worldwide problem, not just Korea, that people are experiencing.
So the last question.
Last one. Thank you.
I have to say that it was a really great pleasure and also a luck to have you as our professor at Korea University. And
Thank
we
you.
really appreciate your teaching and your philosophy and everything. I recently had a chance to visit KU, Korea University, and then I was shocked to find out that about 50% of Korean university students are not just from Seoul, but they are from Gangnam.
Interesting. Yes.
And in my years, class, as you know, I'm your class 87. In my years, I believe more than 70% of Korean university students are from countryside.
Yeah.
And people like me, like born in Seoul and raised in Seoul, we were the minority. But now, to me, when I see Korea today, it seems like a closed society. Back then in 80s, 90s, it was open society. So I'd like to ask your opinion, comparing to the Korea to USA, for example, because baby boomers are the backbone of the USA, and the 386 generation of Korea is a backbone of Korea. When you compare the two countries, do you think one country is more closed than the other? And if that's the case, why do you think we see the pattern?
Oh, great question. Before I answer the question, I have to say that this student she asked me, what do you think of feminism once in class? A very sort of 386-ish question, which I remember is, very, very good discussions we had in class. I think it's a perception issue in the United States as well as in Korea. In other words, younger people in the United States perceive things as very rigid and very fixed. And if you look at, say, the infographics that appear in, say, the New York Times or the Washington Post, that if you're born in a certain area of the United States, a sort of wealthy area with a high level of education, that your chances of going to a good university are 3 or 4 times higher than somebody who is not. So I think this perception of society as having low social mobility is something that both countries are experiencing, and that would be affecting the millennial generation in the United States, and their perceived sort of alienation from society that is prevalent in American society. What is it? 팔팔팔 세대, the sort of whatever the 880,000 won generation. This younger generation in Korea is perceiving the same thing. So, which country is more? I don't really know. I think they're almost the same in many ways. The social mobility having slowed down is common to both countries, I think. And that's causing the younger generations to feel alienated and to demand change. So it's an interesting question. Yes, thank you.
Okay, let's give it.